this not look horrible from the beginning this time. We already have foundation added, so let's actually take advantage of that and structure our markup in such a way that it'll look kind of nice. So foundation is built around a grid system. So you can lay things out according to a predefined grid. They have actually changed the... I think they've changed the documentation a little bit. Yeah, they have. They broke this out into... Oh, a totally new grid system in 6.4. Thanks, Foundation. Has all the variety inbuilt in the form of multiple grid types, which includes margin grid, padding grid, frame grid, block grid, and vertical grid. Okay, great. So basics. The structure of XY grid uses grid X, grid Y, and cell as its base. So why did they have to change this? That's okay. So we want our grid to be horizontal. We want it to be columns basically. So that would be grid X. Before that was just row, the class that you would put on one of those. Now it's grid X. That's fine. It's more flexible now. You could do it the other way if you wanted to. That's kind of cool. So if we want to lay this out using a grid, we will make a div with a class of grid X. Or really anything with a class of grid X. So in our body, first thing we're going to do is make a div with a class of grid X. Hey, what's the CSS selector syntax for a class? Dot. Check this out. Using emit, div. Of course I am. So emit, which I mentioned briefly yesterday, that I can use to expand things to make my HTML kind of quickly. You can use selectors like IDs and classes and so on in those abbreviations. So I could say div dot grid dash X and hit my expand shortcut, and it just makes me the grid with a class of grid-x. Pretty nice. And it puts your cursor in between too. So let's make this readable here. And then it looks like, by default, it's a grid of 12 units. So if I wanted this to take up the middle 8 out of 12, I could say class equals medium 8 on this next div. So the cell class applies some of the things that some of the CSS rules that apply no matter how wide the thing is, and then this just specifies the width. So let's go with that. Let's say another div, class of medium 8, and a class of cell. And just to make sure that this is working, let's go ahead and put our H1 in here. And let's see what happens. Let's inspect this to see what's happening CSS-wise. Oh, look, it's not the entire width, is it? So I think it works. But I didn't just want any 8 cells out of the 12. I wanted the middle 8, right? Gutters, grid container, auto sizing, blah, 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 blah. What about offset? Here we go, offsets. They add some margin for us. So if I say medium offset 2, So I want the middle 8 out of 12, right? So 2 on the left, 2 on the right, that's 4. 8 plus 4 is 12. So if we offset it by 2, that should work. So we have medium 8 in cell. Let's have medium offset 2. So multiple classes inside the class attribute are just separated by spaces. Yay. Look at that. It's the middle. Now what's with this medium business? So Foundation is a responsive CSS framework. Anybody heard the term responsive design before, or responsive CSS? So what that means is it adapts to the width of the browser. So the upshot is phones, tablets, laptops, etc. You can kind of target each of them a little differently. And the way these classes work is, if I say medium 8, that means on medium screens and larger, it'll be 8 columns wide, or 8 cells wide. I could then say on small screens, it's bigger, because we don't want to waste that space. So I could say small 12 or something. Or I could just not specify. If I say only on medium and up do I have this offset of 2 and this thing of 8, then when I get small, it's just going to take up the whole width. So let's watch that happen. Resize my window. Now I'm under the medium threshold. And it looks like the H1 size got smaller and it started hugging the left. Cool. Responsive. It does it for us. It's so easy. Now, we're going to want to make a form that we can type stuff into, right? I'll just put that right under the H1. I don't need an action on that. Inside the form, I'm going to have an input and a button. But if we look at Foundation, it has some styles for forms. Easy, powerful, versatile form layout system. Blah, 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 blah. Now, this page actually doesn't tell us quite everything we want to know. But if we look for inline labels and buttons. So what I'd like is what we saw here, where this is kind of right next to the field instead of being on the next line. In fact, maybe I want it like actually hugging the right side of the text field. That'd be cool. So we'll make it an input group. So to attach extra text or controls, as seen here, like where this is just like growing off of that, wrap the elements in an input group container. I notice it says dot, in other words, with a class of input group. So inside the form, I will put a div with a class of input group. Inside that div, then, put the class input group field on the text field. Input type text class equals input group field. Now we're not quite done putting attributes on this thing. So this is going to get a little hard to read, especially at this size on a screen that size. So I'm going to go ahead and put my attributes on separate lines indented underneath this, and I will put the closing angle bracket aligned with the opening angle bracket. And again, inputs don't have closing tags, right? So we'll go ahead and give it a name too, so we can refer to it later. Call it flick name. And instead of labels this time, just to show it off, we'll use a placeholder. So placeholder is a new attribute in HTML5. Name a flick. What does that do? See that little faint placeholder text? As soon as I start typing, that goes away. As soon as it's gone again, that shows up. All right. So we want a button, and it said input group button, place the button inside this wrapper. In other words, if you look at its example here, and by the way, the documentation for Foundation is amazing, and there are videos for absolutely every single thing it does. The submit button, you put inside a div with a class of input group button. You don't put it on the button itself. So after the input, I will put an input group button div. With Emmet, if you just leave the element name off and just put a class, it will assume div by default. So I'm taking advantage of that there to do as little typing as possible. I put control spacebar, but that is not the default. But if you did the stuff that's listed on the website, on the tools page, yeah. It's tab by default, but the thing is there's a lot of other autocomplete stuff that also uses tab. So I wanted a unique keyboard shortcut for it. So then you can just put the button in here. Please silence your cell phones. Or your Macs, as it were. I wouldn't have had my volume up. All right, so we'll make our button, and it should be a submit type button, right? We want it to submit the form. And we'll have it say add flick or something. Save that. Check it out. Okay, so it's hugging the right side, but there's no border, there's no padding, there's no nothing. If you look at their example, they have a class of button on it too. So if we throw that on our button, then some CSS rules apply. There's a whole section on buttons in the documentation here. If we go down to controls on the left side, under controls we see button. So the basics, if you put a class of button on it, then it will do what we just saw. But you can also affect the color of it by adding some additional classes like success button for green, alert button for red. There's some others too. They're all listed here. Primary, secondary, success, alert, warning. We'll make this success. Why not? So class equals success button. Again, this is getting a little long to fit on screen. Cool. And it's green, hooray. So you have to have the input group class on the div that contains both of those things, the input and the button. Okay. Yay, beautiful form. Doesn't do anything yet, but okay, I'm going to go ahead and commit this. This is a step in the process. Add. Oh, wait. I'd like a way to uniquely identify this form in a perfect world. So form ID equals, let's call it flick form. I usually dasherize IDs in HTML, just like classes here. Add. Let's make sure if I do a Get status here. Yeah, it's not staged yet because we're letting Visual Studio Code do that for us. But we could always do it the manual way. Add flick form.